Good morning and welcome to our virtual Partnership Milwaukee Alumni Forum. Thank you all for your patience. This is our first time using this new platform, so we had a few kinks to work out. My name is Samantha Mitchell. As many of you know, I am the Engagement Manager for United Way's Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives. I'm so happy to see many of you here today, and thank you all for joining us and for your support of United Way and our community through your participation in Partnership Milwaukee. We have a really great discussion lined up for you all. During today's call, you will hear from Martha Berry, County Executive David Crawley, Hardeep Singh Kalika, and Jamal Smith, each of whom has made important contributions to the work to dismantle institutional racism. Before we get started, I'd like to invite United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County's President and CEO, Amy Leonard, who is also a Partnership Milwaukee alum, to give a few remarks.
Thanks, Sam. I want to express my gratitude to everyone on this call who has participated in Partnership MKE and everyone's commitment to learn how to lead and communicate across difference. I was part of the first cohort of Partnership MKE, which happened as the same year as my first year at United Way. It's the only sort of put outside thing, and it's a United Way program, but it's the only sort of extra thing I participated in that whole year. And I'm so very grateful I did. In our current times, in all times, I can't think of a more important skill than learning to communicate and lead across difference. This program wouldn't be possible without the leadership and investment of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, who've been incredible leaders and incredible partners in our community. So it's been a pleasure to work with Miriam Rosenzweig, President and CEO of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, and her team on creating a shared vision for Partnership MKE. On that note, I'd like to invite Miriam to share her thoughts on why Partnership MKE is a very valuable program for the Federation and what makes our partnership so important.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to everyone here who's participating and to Sam who's put this all together. I moved to Milwaukee just about a year and a half ago, and one of the moments of pride that I had was to learn about this program, to learn about the investment that not just the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, but United Way and all of you have made in order to learn together, to collaborate together. And in the last several months, life as we know has changed dramatically and in unimaginable ways. And we find ourselves at a historic moment in time that will define us for years to come. Future generations will look back and measure the character of our community and of our leadership. I recently heard a definition of leadership as accepting the responsibility for enabling others to achieve a shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. Partnership MKE is all about this. This pandemic, this time in our lives, the death of George Floyd and the anger and outrage that followed has helped us understand that just like the pandemic taught us that healthcare is not an individual issue, the events following George Floyd's death has taught us that racism is not the issue of the victim. It is the responsibility of all of us, of society, to respond to. And that's what we're doing with Partnership MKE. That's why it's so important to have this collaboration where all communities come together to understand each other and understand their starting points. It's accepting the responsibility to learn and to educate, to achieve the shared purpose where community, the right and dignity and opportunity are available to everyone is a shared responsibility. And let's admit, we are in the face of uncertainty. And it's incumbent upon all of us to be a part of the solution. So I want to thank you. I want to share with you that on behalf of the board of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, chair of the board, Moshe Katz, is on this call. We are behind you. We are committed to continuing this program. We are humbled to continue to learn, and we will continue to support it and own our part in it. So thank you so much, and I look forward to this program.
Thank you both. I'd also like to recognize Jenny Tassi with the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, who works very closely with me on advancing the work of Partnership Milwaukee. Thank you, Jenny. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to share a few housekeeping items. At the end of the presentation, we'll take some time to respond to your questions. Feel free to submit your questions to the group through the chat box on your screen throughout the presentation, and we'll address those questions at the end of the discussion. Please note that today's presentation will be recorded and we'll follow up with a link to the video. Now I'm going to invite the panelists to briefly tell us a little bit about themselves, and I'll have Martha kick us off.
Thanks, Sam. I'm Martha Berry, the Chief Racial Justice Officer at the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin, and our mission is around eliminating racism and empowering women. And so I've had the great good fortune to work in the organization for the last 13 years in lots of ways, trying to get more and more people, particularly white people, engaged in conversations and taking actions and figuring out where they can plug in. So I'll share more when we get to the question and answer. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. County Executive David Crawley.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you for allowing us all to be on this this webinar, and thank you for everybody attending. I am County Executive David Crowley, born and raised here in the city of Milwaukee. Got involved doing community organizing before getting involved in politics, and I as well was a part of the first cohort of Partnership MKE as well.
Thank you. Pardeep Singh Kalika.
Hey, thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for being on today. It's an honor to be on with everybody, Martha, David, Jamal. Thank you to Samantha, Amy, Miriam, Jenny, everyone that's been partners in putting this on. I'm the Executive Director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, and also just became the Executive Director of the Zeidler Center. With the Interfaith Conference, we take on faith diversity and embracing everyone because they bring in their faith. And with the Zeidler group, we really take on just tough dialogues within the community. And yeah, it's an honor to be on. Thank you.
Thanks, Pardeep. And Jamal Smith.
Right, thanks, Sam. Thank you for this opportunity. Glad to be a part of this conversation. I just realized I'm probably the only person on here without a leadership title, but I just want to be amongst the cool table. Jamal Smith, the Violence Prevention Manager for the City of Milwaukee Health Department, Office of Violence Prevention. Our work is centered around how to elevate the best strategies that support addressing systemic and structural violence, in addition to any other types of violence that exist on a daily basis. And a lot of my work is centered around public policy advocacy, community engagement, and the implementation and elevation of the Blueprint for Peace.
Thank you all. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started with our first question. As we think about confronting racial equity and inclusion in diverse work environments, how can we approach senior leadership to advocate for anti-racist institutional change in the workplace without fear of being retaliated against? And I'll have Jamal dive in and answer this first. A second piece to that is, do you have a personal or observed example of attempted or successful institutional reform?
Sure. Well, I think the greatest approach to this has been really through like ERGs. This is not something, when you're talking about addressing an entire change within an institution, this is not something that you approach with a singular person, right? So there are opportunities for, employee resource groups to come together, have these types of conversations and then present this to senior leadership. It's always going to be a challenge regardless of the manner in which that you have this discussion. But the best way is to ensure that you're doing it with like-minded people. There's always an opportunity for fear of retaliation, right? Regardless of whether that's an ERG or what have you, because of the fact of you're talking about an institutional change, right? Which makes people uncomfortable, right? People hate what they fear. People fear what they don't understand, and they hate what they fear, right? So if I already have this fear, I'm not understanding of the reason why you want to change the atmosphere. And we've grown to develop it in such a manner, and then now you're presenting this change that's going to put up some defense mechanisms for those who are in senior leadership, which then brings about that potential retaliation. But at the same time, if there are groups that are being formed where people are like-minded and speaking to the same issue with uniformity, then I believe that's what allows for there to be more impact. I think one of the greatest examples we saw of that, and this was during my time at the YWCA, is when we went to Rockwell Automation, and one of their ERG group had actually had Martha come in to do a session around anti-racism practices, but it took the group to actually present that, because initially, you know, there was some hesitation, but the fact that you had a group that said, look, this is something that we know we need. This is not just something we want to see. This is a necessity. And the fact that there were people in leadership who were willing to listen, because of the fact that you saw a group of people who were genuinely concerned about the impact of racism throughout Rockwell, I think that speaks to people being willing to put themselves out and really bring about that necessary institutional transformative change. So I think Rockwell had was one of the better examples that I've seen, with a group of people who were willing to really speak out against institutional racism.
Thanks, Jamal. Would anyone else like to chime in on that question?
Just to piggyback on what Jamal, and as far as Rockwell, even does, kudos to them. They became one of the first corporations to actually have an ERG around faith. And for many people within the world, you know, within sort of the Western landscape, we think that we can separate faith in the person, or the faith in the culture. And within a lot of people around the world, they can't do that. And a lot of cities and urban landscapes are being rebuilt by immigrants from different parts of the country. And to not understand a part of the faith understands not recognizing the part of the person. So we have called, and this Interfaith has called for other corporations to get involved, such as Rockwell has gotten involved in understanding and saying, we embrace your faith as well as everything else that comes with your experience. And then so they have a group called Faith Friendly Allies, and have been really courageous on really taking on this sometimes contentious sort of part of people's lives, because we can, I mean, and we recognize this as far as a faith group and working for policy and you know, a separation between the faith and politics, and calling for that as well. But how America is changing, and maybe the Constitution in its original foundation, it was not really meant for the people that are living through it right now, and how we need to go back and revisit all of that, and how it's actually healthy to do so. So as far as even talking about how do we get some of the people who have been the seniors of part of these organizations, I think the difference is between participation and prescription. And within a mental health lens, we know that both have some efficacy. That prescription, saying and educating is one thing, but also having them participate in it, and somehow maneuvering that creativity to say, hey, I need you to participate in the well-being of your corporation 100 years from now. Let's make it viable that that exists, but let's make it so that it's serving the purpose of the community. And so I think just, yeah, Rockwell has done, and everyone, and you know, as far as YWCA has done a phenomenal job of having those difficult dialogues.
Thank
And
you.
just to chime in a little bit, I mean, I guess the first time that I was involved in really trying to change something institutionally, I can say, or at least on a macro scale, is when I was involved in, for example, the ACLU lawsuit with the Milwaukee Police Department. And when we think about those types of things, you know, a lot of the times what happens is that people don't want to participate because they're trying to protect something for themselves. And a lot of the times they don't think about protecting themselves is not going to get them far. But if we want to really make sure that this institution is doing right by the community, we have to focus on the sustainability and making sure that you're open to anti-racism type of policies, making sure that you're open to different types of people who believe in different things, no matter what religion or zip code they believe in. A lot of the times what ends up happening is people are afraid to have these discussions because they feel like it's going to maybe change them for the better in some cases. But a lot of the times people are just afraid to have these conversations. I'm glad that we're now able to have these conversations, because I would say on a macro level, 6 months ago, we weren't, you know, but because COVID, both pandemics with COVID-19 and with racism, we have a intersection where we have to start having these conversations, because this is about the sustainability of who we are as people here in America and what we want America to be moving forward.
The only thing I would add, Sam, is thank you all, because I think you've all added important points, is that I think there's a way that many organizations, if you work in a larger corporation, may have had a DE&I initiative, some diversity and equity inclusion. And many of those organizations, while doing good work, hadn't necessarily had the tough conversations about race and racism. It wasn't top priority. It wasn't, it's almost like Pardeep talking about faith. You're supposed to leave a part of yourself at the door. Don't show up as your full self, as a Black man, as an Asian man, whoever you are. That it was like, do the job. And now suddenly, because of these two pandemics, like Executive Crowley has pointed out, we can't avoid it. We have to have those conversations. And I think organizations are struggling, and that's okay. But I think there's a lot of people internal to those organizations that have probably been trying to say, we need to address this. And now it's like, we can't ignore it anymore. So don't assume that you as one individual can't have an impact on your organization, your association, your business. Keep speaking up. It really requires courage and bravery and, getting other people to join you.
Thank you, Martha. That was a good segue into the next question here that I'd like you to expand a little bit more on. What are some examples of local individuals or groups who use their privilege to affect change and be a strong ally? And you can be as specific or general as possible, or as you may.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think there's lots of organizations. The YWCA has offered lots of classes and gotten people having more in-depth conversations about race and racism. But what I've witnessed are people taking an issue and being very clear, like, I need to do something about racism and its impact on the environment and climate change. And so there's groups like the Sierra Club and some of those that are really white-dominated organizations that are really trying to take to heart, we have to look at these issues and figure out how we can address those. But what I've seen is horrific situations happen and people decide to get involved. So the situation of Jay Anderson being killed in a parking lot in Wauwatosa. And now there's a group called Tosa Together, which was largely driven by some folks that lived in Tosa who said, this is unacceptable. We're not getting good answers from, the folks running the city. And so we need to do something about this, and really pulled themselves together and thought long and hard about what does that mean that we're going to do? How are we going to keep this this issue really front and center and keep addressing it? So that was largely a group of white women, to my knowledge. There could have been others. I think there's a lot of school districts that are struggling to face some of the challenges, and now it's blown up around them in terms of how do we think about going back to school, et cetera. But there's some really amazing individuals, and United Way has supported the Community Schools Initiative, and I've seen a lot of folks come together under that umbrella. I think there's some community groups besides, I mentioned Tosa Together. Bridge the Divide is up in Cedarburg, and I think it's Bay Bridge in Whitefish Bay, largely started by white folks, although often with folks of color advising, trying to bring community members together to look at, the racism, we keep hearing about this stuff keeps happening in our communities. Why are these things continuing to happen? What can we do to address it, and bringing people together? I've seen bids. I've seen people in different sectors decide, we as a bid, so take Menominee Valley Partners, we're serving in lots of different ways. How do we bring people under this umbrella to help us try to advance some of that? And Pardeep can certainly speak to some of the faith-based initiatives. There's a lot of different church groups that have said, we have to put this up. And I know one of them, what is the East Side Church? Now it's going to escape me. Unitarian Universalist had their Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter, yeah.
Lives Matter banner on their building for a long time, probably for a year or two, and it would get ripped down, and they'd put another one up, and it's been challenging for them because it's largely a white congregation in many cases. And if we're going to be committed to this, what does that look like? So I think there's any number of sectors and ways that people can get engaged. And I think particularly for white people, the thing that we have to remember is that folks of color have been fighting this fight for a long time. Let's talk centuries. And this is not, this is not something that we get to sort of dip our toe in and then dip back out like, oh, that didn't work well. I have to keep figuring out what does it look like to keep showing up. And as witnessed in Portland with the protests that have been going on for close to 60 days, maybe it is 60 days now. And now everybody's talking about this wall of moms, is that what they're calling it? Wall of moms. And it's largely white women that have showed up to support, which is great. And then I think they were joking about the suburban dads that showed up with their leaf blowers to sort of blow away the tear gas, et cetera. What ends up happening in some of those situations is that the conversation gets centered then around whiteness and what the white people were able to do, instead of being able to look more deeply at what was going on for folks of color continuing to fight this good fight. And now it's about white people. No, we're losing sight of what are we fighting for? What are we trying to change? What are the what are the underpinnings of systemic racism that have been in our nation since the beginning, and we haven't reconciled? What are we going to do to support some of those things? So obviously there's a tons of things I could say, but hopefully that addressed the basics. And I'm sure this group has lots of other things they can add in.
I just want to say thank you for that, because that was, I think you're hitting it right on the head. You have a lot of groups from all over the city, all over the county, particularly here, even when I think about some of the business groups that have actually stepped to really focus on racism as a public health crisis since we've made that declaration here in Milwaukee County. So, we've seen like the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, we've seen like the MMAC step up and say that, no, we want to tackle these things because we know that it's a problem. If you want to see this region, this particular area move forward, you have to start making sure that we're bringing many more diverse voices to the table. And, I know we always talk about strong allies, and strong allies are good, but what's even better are co-conspirators, right? I need accomplices to be right next with me. So when we are on the front lines marching about police accountability or prison reform, it's not about, well, why are you here and how do you support? It's really about making sure we continue to talk about the message. And sometimes what happens is once you start to bring all these diverse groups and individuals to the table, the message get lost. And so we need to make sure that we continue to focus on the goal at hand, focus on that big picture when we bring allies to the table. And many of them want to be brought to the table and don't know what to do, don't know what's the first step to make. So we have to, one, make sure that we're building relationships, because just like you said, Martha, I don't need you to dip your toe in right now and then leave back out, once it's convenient. Because right now, Black Lives Matter is convenient for a lot of people because it's in our face. COVID-19 is a blessing and a curse. The curse because we know what it is doing to the people here throughout the world when you think about the healthcare aspect of it. But one thing it has done is it eliminated many of the distractions from around us, to where, no, people are saying, "What? Why are you all reacting to this?" We aren't reacting. The distractions have been eliminated around you, to where now some people are now have to pay attention when they've had the luxury of not paying attention. And so, there are a lot of people on the ground who are doing this work, but we just have to make sure that when we talk about allies, we keep them in the game.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on the county executive and Martha and just everything, there's a lot of people and organizations. So if I start to name somebody, I fear that I'm going to forget somebody. But there's a lot of within our sector, being the faith community, and definitely Reverend Nordstrom being a First Unitarian, Miriam on this call, the Jewish Federation, JCRC, the Islamic Society of Milwaukee, the ELCA community, and that I have seen within my year of being an interfaith, and so even with institutions, the 50-year-old organization, and this is the first time that we've had a director that has been not something other than a white male, and navigate and then understanding and saying, okay, now we have a 49-year-old interfaith organization that is only centered around a particular faith. Now, the irony of all of that, to say we have an interfaith organization centered around a particular faith of dominance. And what does that create? What is that? Who does that leave off the table? Who does that not bring? So with that said, over the past year, I've seen a lot of movement, a lot of just courageous conversations, and I've also seen a lot of just courageous statements that are being made. Now, the part that we want to get to is a place of follow through. And that's the thing, that's what we're speaking about right now, is don't dip your foot or toe in the water and then step away. Don't be inspired without being committed. And so we need to stay committed and really then we got to consciously think about what is it that we're centering? Who is what? And you know, even I can, as we talk about privilege, I thought about me having the privilege of next week will be the 8th anniversary of the Sikh temple shooting. And now not everybody gets the coverage that we got. Not everybody and my hope was always that I can use my life to inspire and say, okay, how do we create this kind of response for all communities? How do we create this response? But I got to understand that that doesn't happen. And so now, now the hope is to use my own personal privilege and say, how do I center other people's lives? How do I center? And I think that we're kind of getting to that consciousness, but it's going to take some work.
Thank you. Jamal, did you have anything to add, or are you good?
I'm good.
Okay.
they got it.
So as we think about allies and community and reform, now that we're in a time where many are calling for institutional change and large reforms, what do you see as a good starting point to advocate for systems change in the Milwaukee community? Are there steps community leaders can start to make today in their own workplace or sphere of influence? And I'll have County Executive David kick us off with this answer.
I think that's a great question. I mean, for me, I always start with relationships, right? Nobody cares what you know until they know how much you care. And we really have to really break down, all of these silos and start to have honest conversations about who we are and what our experiences are here growing up in the city of Milwaukee or the Milwaukee community in general. And, when we think about like what steps to make, that's, I don't think that, it depends on what our sphere of influence is, right? And I think that when we think about what steps we need to make, I mean, one, if you're a white person, understand that it is not people of color's job to solve racism. I think that's one thing that we have to come to the terms of, because as we continue to have these conversations, people ask me, well, what should I do? And in reality, I should be asking you, what can you do? And it's really about how we all need to step up. But I also would say that because of the times that we're in right now, I'm about, especially when you think about what can leaders do right now, we need to figure out where rationale can meet the radical, because we need radical reforms, but we also need to be rational about where we are and how we can actually make it happen. And so for me, yes, I'm the Milwaukee County Executive, but when I think about the protests that have been going on for over the past 60 days, I know many of those protesters. I have organized with many of them. And so I can go to them and have those radical conversations about what needs to change within the police department, what needs to change within the criminal justice system. But I'm the one who understands the process and understands the players that is a part of the change. And so how do I bring not only those who are on the ground, but those who have absolute influence in making the change to meet with one another? When we think about, and most of the time it's because people choose to be ignorant to the rationale. So when we say what's radical is divesting from the police, but really is it? What we're saying is that the police department are called to get cats out of the trees. Police departments are called to because somebody's barbecuing in a park. Police departments are called because somebody is bird watching. How do we start to hold ourselves accountable and build the community up where they can hold others accountable as well? And that's where the rationale comes in, because it's like we're defunding or divesting to put more money into mental health programs, to put more money into the services that people absolutely need, so we don't have to have as much police officers on the streets. And it's not to say that we don't need them, I'll let you all have that discussion on your own, or whoever's watching. But I think what we're saying is that we have to look at policing differently, right? And again, I think the one thing that we can all do is figure out, what does rationale meet the radical thinking, so we can make the change that we want to see. But more importantly, that's how we build some of these leaders up as well, who are coming after us. Because I used to be that radical kid. I used to wear my fatigues. I had my combat boots on. I had my Timberlands on, because I was in the streets ready for war whenever it was coming. But the war changed, and it got different for me, and my fight became different. But we have to find ways to bring more people together so we can continue this sphere of influence. Because at the end of the day, like, it took us more than a week. It took us more than 60 days. It took us more than a century to be in the place that we are in right now. So we have to think about, it's going to take some time. And so we just need to make sure that we're bridging the necessary gaps and building the necessary relationships to continue to move forward. And, I'm talking a lot, but I just want to quickly say, that's one of the things that Partnership MKE actually did for me. It was like Match.com, but in reverse, right? You're partnering up with somebody who grew up in a totally different situation than you. And I can tell you that to this day, Angela Quigley, married in Milwaukee, who I was partnered up with, we still talk on at a minimum weekly basis about how we can work together. Whether what she's doing, because she's very involved in the movement, and vice versa. And she's a white woman who wants to get involved, and she'll tell you that she's not an ally. She wants to be an accomplice.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone?
So what I'll say to that,
jump in.
So what I will say to that is the importance of recognizing something that we call credible messengers, right? Sometimes we always look at, people who are in like a position like with David or Martha and Pardeep, and feel like those are the people we should be listening to. When in all actuality, you got people who've been leading these protests for the last 60 days who are also people that need to be listened to, right? So there's so many different experiences, regardless of the appearance. Because I could just see Dave Crowley. I could see you, Dave, looking like you was flat out a Wu-Tang Clan. But that doesn't mean that just because you had that attire on, doesn't mean you didn't have the intellectual capacity to be able to verse or say exactly what the concerns are, right? We understand that many people look at those who are on ground daily fighting for systemic change. Many people look at them and have this idea of, that's not who we should be following as a leader, because look at their appearance. Look at, some of what, whether that's the fire that is coming out, like a lot of the aggression that is coming from protesters. But at the same time, it's like, you have to understand the reason why that aggression exists, right? And there is no reason for us to have this type of aggression if there hasn't been aggression that has been geared towards us. So it's getting people to understand that bringing everyone in the same sphere, in the same space, and being willing to have conversations with people who may not look like you, who may not reflect, the ideal image that you think they should have. Still getting everybody in the room to be able to talk about what are ways that we could coexist and create these multi-sector, these multicultural platforms, because we got to understand the complexity of racism. And there's not a singular approach to the complexity of racism by any means. So assuming, as much as YWCA has done, as much as Interfaith has done, as much as the declaration of racism as a public health crisis from the county, as much as the Office of Violence Prevention has done, there's no way that we can be able to do this work without the people who are on the ground also, who are daily talking about the need for reform and systemic change, right? We can look historically, and even talking about the Fair Housing Acts or fair housing marches during the 60s and 70s, right? There is no chance of that ordinance being passed without realizing the 200 nights of protests that happened and how they brought so much attention on a national level, which then spurred them to make action change on a policy within the policy. So we have to understand that bringing everyone together is of a necessity in doing this work. And that means that we're going to be in spaces where you're having conversation with people who you normally would not. But at the same time, if we're all thinking like-minded with the idea of talking about equity and justice and freedom and the likes there, and liberty, you know, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, laissez-faire, if that's where we're all looking, then that means that there's got to be a strong platform that is created that brings in all different types of people to have those same conversations, as well as then say, this is the action, these are the actions that we have to enforce. And we're ensuring that those who are amongst the elitists, those who are not willing to truly create that space or be a part of this work that brings about that fundamental change, we're holding them accountable. But that means it's got to be from a multi-tiered approach.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of thinking about this, the sphere of influence and credible messengers, and thinking about everyone that's on this call right now. There needs to rest some humility in leadership. And each one of the leaders that are on this call understands that their servant's towel is much bigger than, you know, is their biggest towel of all. And then really, when we think about sometimes even allyship and being able to reach somebody, you have to kind of know your limitations. I have limitations, and I liken this to, you know, within the spiritual fabric of Sikhi, we talk about, you know, the guru who has basically gotten to be too enlightened. And once you do get so enlightened, your arms are only so long that you can only reach so many people. And sometimes you're not reaching the people that you thought that you were reaching, and you have to have some humility by knowing the limitations of your arms. And that's when you rely on everyone else to be able to do some of the work and some of the stuff that, and within leadership, if that exists, then we can truly create a village. But that village needs to rest in humility and just nurturing.
So the only thing I would add is thanks, David, for starting us off with, you know, where rationale meets radical ideas. And I think there's such a way that radical feels unsettling to people, and yet radical is about roots and getting at the roots of this nation have been based in systemic racism for too long. And if we're not willing to look at how do we radically change, we're not going to be successful in disrupting what has been a status quo for way too many people. And if we want that status quo to go away, it's going to require what many of you have said, the relationships that we have with one another matter, and being able to track each other and have those hard conversations when we get off track and say, you know, I need you back over here, I need you to do this, and be able to follow each other's leads. There's just places like humility and courage and bravery and all those kinds of characteristics that need to show up. And at times we're like, but I can't do it. Well, okay, so what is the piece you can do? You know, like if you're not in the streets fighting, that doesn't mean you're not fighting it. And, you know, like, what does it look like for you? What does it look like to support racism as a public health crisis for the county, for the city, for the region? You know, how do we start thinking about the issues that I do care about, and how do I get involved? Because maybe it's, I need to donate money. Maybe that's the piece I can figure out. You know, maybe it's that I need to support somebody else who's doing some of those things. So how do we do it together using the best of all those minds and hearts and spirits? And you know, because there's times like we have to just completely implode things so that we can figure out new ways to do it. And that's unsettling. It's hard, you know, like think about change management. None of us feel good about COVID and being, you know, like, are you sick of your living room? Are you sick of your dining room? Are you sick of certain places in your house? And you're like, can everybody just leave me alone? You know, and there's nowhere to go. And then at times we just have to step back and go, okay, but what can I do in this moment? How do I want to handle it? What will that look like? And recommit to the unsettling sense of this is not going to be tidy, it's not going to be neat, and it's going to take us a while. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Every role isn't for everybody, but there's always a role for somebody.
Get in the road.
Thank you all. That was really, really good. Before I move to the next question, I just wanted to remind our viewers, if you all have any questions, to throw them in the chat box, and we will answer them during the Q&A after this next question. So we talked about this some, about being confronted with the pandemic and the racism, and jobs have been affected, families have been affected, lives have been lost. How are discussions about mental health and mental health support important in the workplace and in your sphere of influence as well at home? And I'll have Pardeep kick us off with this response.
Sure. Thank you, Sam. And I met, as far as being intentional about mental health, everything that I try to do, even with Interfaith or in the organizations that we collaborate and work with, I'm trying to introduce mental health and looking at it from that lens. So even as the county executive and Jamal, we were talking about, we're talking about zone of proximal development. We're talking about Vygotsky's formula. And the hope is really that we can, and within Office of Violence Prevention, the hope is that we can create a strategy to create to kind of to maybe make mental health not just something that somebody goes to because they're diagnosed or because it's a clinical model, but make it a holistic model that takes on the determinants of health and that has an umbrella sort of mentality of all of Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. I'm sometimes thinking like the world, right? So that's kind of where I go to. Sometimes I drift off into all of that, but want to create a model where we are looking at education differently. We have looked at education the same for a very long time. Today's day and age, you don't need the 40 years ago, I would have had 3 books on a particular subject and then said, okay, let me find out the most information about that particular subject. Today, if you Google in anything, you get thousands, if not millions, of that same research. And we're treating education the same. What you need to get out as a child is to say, what is good for me out of the information that I got? And so we are overstimulated, and we're not teaching people, okay, only take that which is credible, which is good for your health, which is nurturing, and that's the case for a lot of different a lot of different places. So the hope is really just to say, how can we create this model where we understand mental health to not just be some one-off, but to be part of every industry, to be part of everything, and really to create a culture of how do we nurture that person? How do we take care of past trauma? And then, initially when we started to talk about, and I'll just end with this, is that we started to talk about, and I was talking about the Constitution and just how maybe it wasn't written in a way that it embraces everyone to be their best. And I was thinking about this question. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it when he was in a concentration camp. He wrote it when he lost his family members. He wrote it after he became very decorated, and the SS soldier took all of his paperwork and ripped it all up. He was super devastated at that time, and he writes this in the book. He says, I didn't know what to do. When he got back on his feet, he basically became the father of this book and this new type of practice. If he didn't rip all that up, that would have never happened. COVID-19 is asking us to rip some stuff up, to rip some shit up, honestly. It's asking us to take this intentional pause and create a society that what, and I'm not saying, and somebody might look at me like, Pardeep's calling for the end of the Constitution. No, I'm not calling for the end of the Constitution. I'm calling for deliberate reform that is much more than lip service. This no webinar is going to get me in a lot of trouble.
We got your back, Pardeep.
We got you, bro. We got you. We got you.
Just have my back. All right? Yeah, but I think so. That's what I feel like. This COVID-19 is a very spiritual time to reform and make sure that we're working for the well-being of all.
Mm-hmm.
I think you hit it around the head, particularly when you talk about COVID-19. Because we talked about, when this first hit, we said social distance, when in reality, we should have been telling people to be as social as possible while physical distancing. right? Because we've seen how this has had an impact on individuals. Because I'm an extrovert, and so doing all this screen talk all the time definitely takes a toll on me. And it's funny because whenever we talk about whether we talk about mental health or health, it becomes political. And so I found a way to talk about it on the spectrum of mental wellness, right? Because a lot of the times when we think about mental health, people go to a crisis moment. And you don't have to have a crisis moment when you think about you need to be in a space that's good for you mentally. And so when you think about where are you on the mental wellness spectrum, you can be, you don't have to be diagnosed to feel depression. You don't have to be diagnosed to feel all these negative aspects that's happening in our lives. And we have to become comfortable having a conversation about where we are as it relates to our headspace, because we have to, if you actually think about it, especially when you think about work, especially if you're in anti-racism work together, we all heavily lean on one another to get the work done. And if we don't understand where we are as partners, as accomplices, as allies, it's going to be hard to continue to move forward or move far together versus us trying to move fast by ourselves. And so, we have to continue to have these conversations around mental health, particularly during these times. Again, we're in the middle of two pandemics, two of them, right? And, one of them is acute in a healthcare crisis, and the other one is deeply rooted in racism. And so one of them has been with us for over 400 years. The other one, we're still working on a vaccination for. And even if we get a vaccination, where will we still be? Where would our head space still be as a people? And so we have to have some honest conversations, and we should get comfortable talking about mental health, because as long as we continue to have these, to perpetuate the stigma that's out there, we're going to be leaving so many people behind. And we're doing it purposely because we're choosing not to have the conversation.
I agree. And I think the reason that we're choosing not to have the conversation is because we really have to start examining the historical impact of mental health and how that is truly, especially when it comes to folks of color and Black people and Black and brown folks in particular, but just people, it's talking about people of color, the impact of generational racialized trauma. Right. And how that continuously manifests itself even in 2020. Right. COVID did nothing but exacerbate the issues that were already there. You know what I mean? Like the Milwaukee Health Department was amongst the first to really start to look at the impact of COVID by race. Right. Which then became a national trend. But it also showed the impact of health disparities within Black and brown communities. But then it forced the conversation of saying, well, why do those health disparities still exist, right? So then talking to Pardee's point earlier of discussing the social determinants of health, okay, now we have to start looking at the impact of mental health. We have to start looking at the impact of economic development or the lack thereof within Black and brown communities. We have to start looking at the impact of education and how, it's become more about the school to prison pipeline versus producing true, authentic scholars, right? We have to start looking at the impact of the criminal justice reform. We have to look at the impact of law enforcement, how all of those different entities have directly impacted for generations Black and brown communities, right? And what does that do psychologically, right? I mean, David, you talked a little bit earlier about the ACLU settlement, right? What does that do for a Black person that every time I see an officer, I get concerned of what can happen with this interaction? Right? Because generationally, we've seen the impact of community police relations, right? Even if it doesn't happen to you directly, it doesn't mean that there isn't a concern that you have because you have seen it happen to people who look like you. So it's got to get to the point where we're having those, we're really being honest in these conversations, and it can't be about anybody's feelings anymore. Right, because for a long time we've always been so politically correct within these types of conversations, and it's left out a grand portion of truth that has really exposed the impact of these disparities. And I think that's why when we talk about a public health crisis, whether that's racism being a public health, whether that's violence, looking at through a public health lens, then that means you have to be willing to look at the complexity of violence and the complexities of racism which then will be able to manifest itself in a way of showing these things are interwoven, and this is why we continuously see what we see within this country, right? And on a global level, right? It's not just within this country, even though it's bigger here than anywhere else, but we know this is happening on a global level. So being able to really talk about how, you know, when it comes to the whole aspect of mental health, right? And how many people are, you know, are really just looking at the effects of the trauma they experience on a regular basis, right? And whether we're talking about unemployment, underemployment, right? Housing, talking about, you know, the mere fact of how policies have been created, which are still long-standing, antiquated policies, which still affects particular populations, and how that continuously builds about that frustration or that anger, which then how that impacts mentally on those populations regularly, right? There's got to be all of those conversations have to be had, and there's got to be some spaces in there where people have to get comfortable being uncomfortable because of the fact that we can't hide behind the truth anymore. We can't hide the truth. Excuse me. We can't hide the truth anymore. We got to be honest in saying this is exactly what has happened, and be willing to deal with the ramifications of those statements and those conversations.
I think the only thing I'd add is just this place of if you're not willing to look at mental health. I mean, I think mental health is part of a continuum. So I like your ideas, David, of talking about a wellness spectrum or somehow to look at it from a broader perspective. These times, it's heartbreaking to know what we're up against, and yet this is the times that call us to sort of rise above ourselves and look at all the stuff that everyone here has been talking about that requires an honesty that I think we haven't been willing to necessarily look at. Like Jamal is saying, in terms of racial trauma and stress, you know, Joy DeGruy book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. I mean, there's so many resources out there. There's no reason for us not to know some of the things that we have been blinded to or, you know, kept ourselves away from. And we all have to be part of the equation. So for some folks, it's like, what are you doing to take care of yourself? So yes, you're out doing the good fight, and whatever that fight looks like for you. How are you also taking care of yourself? Where are you finding joy? What are you doing to make yourself laugh every day? What kind of exercise are you getting? What are you doing to do the personal piece? Because the structural stuff is going to be there, and we need you in that fight long haul. So, you know, everybody's health is at stake, and the challenge is too many lives of color have been deeply impacted what COVID has done. And we, you know, the health disparities alone are, you know, is again one of those places where we have to be willing to look at the hard truths of what needs to change. And, you know, how are we investing lots of money into communities that have been decimated by so much of, you know, white flight and all the resources following white people to suburbs? You know, when are we going to get honest about Milwaukee as a hub? And we need to be thinking about the well-being of the people that are here, and how do we make some of that stuff happen? So all the things, I just want to say ditto, 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 you know, on all the things that you've been saying, because I think there's a bigger picture of what a radical future is going to look like, is going to require us to really step outside of norms that we've taken as givens and need to look really different.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, because one thing about mental health I don't think any of us really touched on, except you, Martha, just briefly, is it's important for self-care when you're in this type of work. Because, you know, when you're doing this type of work, you know, it's easy to burn out and say, I'm done. But in reality, it is important that every so often you take a step back to take care of yourself mentally, so you can continue to push forward and continue to stay involved in this work. So
self-care, what the hell is
that? In the old nomenclature, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual in the 50s, you really couldn't diagnose PTSD. They just called it some kind of war syndrome or shell shock syndrome, or they thought it was for the people that were kind of weak, that went to war and came back and couldn't handle it. Now, fast forward to now, and at that time, you really had to go through it yourself to be diagnosed with it. So I had to go to war. I would be able to be diagnosed with it and then get treatment. Later on, they found out, okay, people that were working with people who were going through some kind of tragic events, they could be diagnosed with it. Fast forward to now, you can be diagnosed with it if you simply hear about and are inundated with it. So to Jamal's point of, all of these kids, and they're seeing this stuff, and it's playing out on TV, it's playing out on social media. I think the next part of diagnosis would really get to a place where people are just inundated with the messages, and the messages can be that somehow, some way, their life doesn't matter. So somehow, some way, they see somebody who looks like them, walks like them, and basically is going through this trauma. They might not have gone through this themselves, but you're seeing this in a lot of society. And so coming back to the point of schooling and education, and even corporate culture needs to be equipped to say, okay, how are we taking this on? The test scores and all that stuff, that doesn't really matter. Even maybe job performance is secondary to mental health, and saying, okay, how are we taking care of this complete person that shows up?
Thank you all for that insight and your transparency throughout this entire discussion. I'm going to switch gears and open up the Q&A section of today's panel. And I do have a few questions that have come through, and I think these are pretty general, so you all can chime in as you see fit. First question: it has been exhausting getting white people to understand race and racism, resistance to hear a different history than what they were told, white denial that there was a different America, different American history. What have you seen are effective ways to get more white people to act?
Oh boy.
Martha?
Thanks for that question. I think there's a way that we have to be honest, and I appreciate the question, because I think it's a way that we are defended in places that make absolutely no sense to defend. We didn't have good history. Our teachers did the best they could, but we missed out on a ton. And so now it's finding ways to ask those hard questions with one another, and sometimes it's with family members, and being able to say, I don't think that's actually accurate. And so the question is, how do you overcome somebody's resistance when it feels like they're fighting for their lives, and you want to say to them, I don't think you need to fight in this fight. You just need to listen. You just need to read. You need to go find resources. And there's amazing authors that are out there if you can get people to look at some of that stuff. And I think the challenge right now is lots of people are turning to like Robin DiAngelo, who's talking about white fragility, and trying to piece people back together in terms of the tough things that they need to be aware of. Well, at the same time, it's like, well, but who's reading James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and Black authors and writers that have been talking about this for a long time? Why aren't we going back and having Black history not just be a month of February? Why isn't it integrated in everything? Why aren't we educating our young people? Why are we allowing the textbooks to be the drivers that are wrong on many fronts and wrong on all kinds of, like Howard Zinn and the People's History of the United States? Why isn't he like central to some of the teachings? What is it? So I get it, and there's lots of places. I grew up in a small white community in southwestern Wisconsin. Went out with my mom, and at some point, this was a number of years ago, when Colin Kaepernick had taken his knee, and these small towns were like, that's just outrageous. I can't believe he's fighting against the flag, and they were convinced that what Colin Kaepernick was saying, they were missing the entire notion of what the man was trying to say. And so, this waitress and this guy that was a friend of my mom's were having this conversation. Yeah, I just think it's wrong. And I said, do you understand why he's taking a knee? Do you even have a sense of why he's taking a knee? Well, but it's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's against the flag. He's anti-American. And I said, he's taking a knee because for hundreds of years, we have ignored ignored Black lives. And we are not doing a very good job of trying to look at that issue right now. And he's doing a simple gesture to get us to look at the issues. And it shut down the conversation. I was like, and I wasn't even on my soapbox. And I thought about it and I realized, okay, did I get them thinking about it? Maybe. Did I not? It doesn't matter. Plant the seed. And there's lots of seeds that need to be planted in lots of different ways. And for me, as I think about it, white people are my people. I got to take them on, and that doesn't always make me happy because there's a lot of us that can be really stupid. And we don't even know we're being stupid. It's that we're being rigid, or we're digging our heels in ways that make absolutely no sense. So I'm going to stop there because I could keep going, but it's not fair to just yell at white people, but there is a way that, come on, people, let's do this.
Yeah, and as concerned as I am with, the person that's supposed to change, I'm concerned about the person that is asking this question as well. The person that's asking this question is exhausted. Oftentimes we're exhausted because, and I'll say even myself and maybe, so then our entire life, we try to overeducate ourselves. We try to speak right. We try to act right. We try to build sort of a successful model of who we are as people of color so that we can show success. And oftentimes we're exhausted because some of the people that are closest and nearest and dearest to us are the ones that may be the ones that are kind of sticking that knife into our side. And usually, like we also deal with people who are outright white supremacists, and we try to get them to come over and kind of like get them de-radicalized is what we call it. That's not as exhausting of work because that outright white supremacist is standing there holding this knife and saying, I hate you, I'm gonna kill you. Where we're exhausted is that person who stands right by us, whispering sweet nothing sometimes, and is just stabbing us. And so typically what we gotta do is we gotta bring that person in front of us and say, okay, this is where you actually are. You're actually up here, and do the best to, again, coming back to self-care and take care of ourselves and whomever is asking this question. I found this time with Trump to be kind of liberating because I've got to say, okay, I don't need to see you anymore because it opened up my eyes to see what people were about, but know why the exhaustion is hurting you.
Yeah, definitely. It gets hard having the conversation all the time. It can be extremely exhausting. But I just want to say, Martha, thank you for saying half those books you have because they right behind me. I have James Baldwin. I have and not just all Black authors, right? Because you have books like Evicted. You have books like The Color of Law. And then one I wanted to make sure that I got was The Lies My Teacher Told Me is a really good book as well. And so to be honest with you, you're going to continue to be exhausted having these conversations, but we have to talk about it. I guess we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And when we continue to have these conversations, again, like a lot of people will say that, well, during this time, everybody's just reacting to George Floyd or reacting to Breonna Taylor. But in reality, we're not. We're not reacting. We've been out here in the movement. I hate when a reporter asked me, well, how long have you been out here marching? You've been out here marching long before me. And so the thing is that so many people have had the luxury of not paying attention until now because the distractions have been eliminated. And so, people have to will be uncomfortable having these conversations, and we have to acknowledge that you're going to be uncomfortable. But that's how we learn. We learn from being put in uncomfortable situations, being in new experiences. And so we just need to, again, build those relationships, have these conversations. And I would say that, understand that not everybody's going to come along. And you have to recognize that, and so sometimes it's just like, if they're going to drown and they're pulling them down to drown, pulling you down to drown you as well, you have to make a decision, and so you can't save everybody. You're not going to get everybody to believe in this anti-racism work. But what you can do is, who that racist is. Who doesn't want to come along. And so how do we get those around us when they start to see them being left out and being, you know, you look back and they see themselves being a straggler, you know, they're going to start to ask themselves, well, where did I go wrong? And sometimes you have to put people in that position in order for them to see the growth within themselves.
I'm going to invite, thank you, David. I'm going to invite Miriam to share her thoughts on this question before we move on.
I think this question is so relevant to all of us. I will say personally that it was really humbling as someone who has been socially active my entire life. My first protest was when I was 13, to realize how much I didn't know. And it's really humbling. I'm a social worker. I would think that I would be in the knowledge part, and to realize some of the institutional racism that I took for granted was shocking. But I want to make an observation as a member of the Jewish community, and because this hit a lot of nerves. And as you can imagine, anytime you have a group of people, there's a lot of different areas, but we saw two shifts. One was complete identification, and one was comparison Olympics, right? This is the Jewish community's narrative. This is the Black community's narrative. We did this, they did that, and now stick in any other community and everybody has their own narrative. And I would challenge us to understand that, first of all, we cannot possibly understand someone else's experience by reflecting on our own. This came to a realization to me during a partnership MKE session about racism and anti-Semitism. And we were talking about the Holocaust. And a Black leader stood up and asked a very simple question. He said, I don't understand how the Germans knew who the Jews were if you're all white people. And I was shaken, and Sam was there, because no one had ever said that to me, and I had a total understanding of his experience in a way that I never understood it before, where he wears his Blackness, whereas I could hide. And so I would challenge us to sympathize and somewhat for the person who's asking the question, because we actually want to learn. And we're completely shaken up right now because we care, and we're showing up. And as Pradeep said, it's easy to blame the white supremacists because they're out there and they're clear. It is really hard to self-analyze and say, where have I contributed when I believe I'm a good person? I'm on team good community. And so I encourage us all to have these conversations and shift this in the same way we shifted mental health. We shifted mental health by saying, we understand that diabetes is a sickness, and we treat it as such. Mental health is the same way. Let's take away the stigma. Well, let's look at these kinds of racism, biases, and say, just because you've had cancer doesn't mean you know what it's like to have back surgery, right? So let's not try to compare, and instead try to hear the other person's experience in its entirety and allow room for not just blame, but for learning and opening. And so I really appreciate everyone's comments, and I learned a lot on this session, but I want to say that I know that I still have a lot to learn, and I will continue, what was the word, not to be an ally, but a active
Co-conspirator.
Co-conspirator. Agitator, but I knew that was the wrong word.
Agitator.
So thank you.
Well, I'll take agitator too. I think one thing that I'll say in this is why there is such an importance of having conversations around the history of racism and racial practices. You know, Martha brought up the thing about Howard Zinn and the people's history of the United States. You know, when people really, let's take for instance, when people talking about George Floyd, right, and figuring like this is just a one-off situation. Most people don't understand that most social uprisings that have happened throughout history have been centered around racism, and what usually kicked them off was a bad experience with law enforcement, right? So like even when you look at the riots in Watts in '65, or when you look at what happened in Detroit and Chicago and in Milwaukee, when you look at what happened in LA in '92, right? All of those different uprisings that happened were centered around the impact of racial oppression, but the spark plug was about that, was usually kicked off by a contact with law enforcement. Like for example, with the Watts riots, what set that off was just one too many traffic stops, right? It had nothing to do with Like there was this big mass fight that happened, and then all of a sudden the riots kicked off. That started with just one too many racist traffic stops, and they had enough. Same thing, and we saw this same thing happen right here at Sherman Park uprising in 2016, and now what we're seeing with George Floyd. So this is why it's important when we're talking about the conversation around racial tyranny and racial oppression, that the ways in which we are exploring the history of it and its current and how it relates within the current context today, and having those conversations and understand that, you know, to David's point, everybody's not going to come along, right? Everybody's still not going to be willing to be a part of the change, you know, because some people have grown within their privilege and feel like this is just a normal way of life. So, but what they can't say is that they didn't know. So when it comes down to being in those spaces where those tough conversations are happening centered around the impact of race and racism, we understand that once that seed is planted, what somebody does with that seed is totally up to them, right? But the seed has been planted. So now it's your responsibility to take that seed and figure out ways to water it, to grow and to learn and to become more versed in the impact of race and racism and oppression, so that then we can figure out ways to change it when we see it happening still today in 2020. And there's one thing that Paula used to always say to us at YWCA, is she would always talk about, you know, when somebody's asking, well, what is it that I need to do, you know, as a white person? You know, how can I be better? Or can you give me some tips? Why I gotta help you? Like, how is it? There should be some moments where you should be willing to go and learn and take the initiative to go and figure this out, because as people of color, we have to figure out ways to navigate this system in spite of the oppression that existed. So it's like, I still have to cater to the privilege within the privilege, which then breeds about another level of frustration. So I think in that same vein, as I'm having conversations with people on a regular basis and talking about oppression or racial tyranny, another aspect of that is, if you truly are concerned and you really want to be a part of the fight around equity and justice and freedom and liberty, then that means there's going to be moments where you have to take the initiative yourself to really get to learn more about how that has been denied a body of people for centuries, and what's going to be your role in order to help change it.
Thank you, everyone. Another question, and Jamal, I'll have you answer this, but Milwaukee County boldly declared racism as a public health crisis last May and has been working diligently behind the scenes to ensure their staff are truly equipped to support the initiatives established. How can local organizations partner to support the work and address systemic racism?
Well, it sounds like a question for David Crowley, Mr. County Executive. But in all fairness, part of it is supporting the work is beginning to examine what are some of the policies within your own organizations that may be contributing to anti-racism, and you know, because when we have conversations about policy change and reform, right? There's a little p, the organizational policies, versus big P, governmental policies. What are some policies within your organization that you need to first begin to examine, analyze, and then change, and then till then your own organization is becoming a model that supports equity across the board, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a part of exactly what happened amongst the county, because that was a long process of, you know, especially in ensuring that all of the employees within Milwaukee County were trained within the Unlearning Racism curriculum. That was a heavy lift. But in looking at local organizations, what are you doing as an organization to ensure that racism is being dismantled within your own confines, right? And then how are we going to ensure that if there are still if there's still racism that's being perpetuated within our organization, what's the accountability and the enforcement of the accountability system that's in place to ensure that this does not happen? Because everybody, we see it all the time in organizations when they say, we do not tolerate racial discrimination. Okay, well, what does that mean exactly? Because you can tell me all day long that you don't tolerate racial discrimination, but what system do you have in place to ensure that this racial discrimination does not happen? And if anybody is violating that declaration of racial discrimination, then is there a termination process? What do you have in place that ensures that this discrimination is not happening? So it's really doing an overall analysis of your own organizations to ensure that we're aligning with this declaration within not just the county, but within the city, of saying, racism is a public health crisis. This is what we're doing as an organization to ensure that we are supporting the work against racism.
I guess to really add on to that is that when you think about outside organizations and what can you do to assist, it's one key word: accountability. You can't just accept what we give you and say that this is what we're doing. You can trust, but you must verify as well. And so you have to hold us accountable in making sure that we're making the necessary changes in policies and the procedures. But I would also say that the other thing that we have to do is that, Milwaukee County did it. The city of Milwaukee did it, right? That's 2 municipalities out of 19, right? Within Milwaukee County alone, you have 19 municipalities, or 20 municipalities if you include Milwaukee County. And so what are other municipalities doing to make sure that they're also on board to what we are doing here in Milwaukee County? We cannot do this work alone. We need to make sure that we're putting pressure on those that are within Milwaukee County and saying that you need to be accountable and doing the exact same thing. And to be honest with you, we see it happening actually across the country now, because you have other counties, villages, and cities across the country who are taking up this issue and declaring racism as a public health crisis. But when I say accountability, you have to look at what is the data that we're looking at and what is the metrics that we're using to know that we're reaching our goals. If you don't understand that, anybody can go ahead and throw out all this data, these metrics, and you can make the assumption that we're doing it, right? We have uplifted more Black women in this administration than has previously been done, right? But if we want to take this into a historical context, we haven't done much. We have not done enough to make sure that we are changing. We are ahead of the curve here. Because we have and I encourage anybody, there was an audit that was done by the comptroller related to Milwaukee County called Pulling Back the Curtain, that broke down income, how much people were making by race and by gender. And it would show you that if you were a white male here in Milwaukee County, and it's still the case in many aspects, that you are going to make the most money. You can have department heads right now who can make $130,000, and a manager 2 levels under them makes $40,000 more than them, and they happen to be a white male, right? And so we have to have some real discussions, but at the end of the day, it's all about accountability.
So much more I could say, but I just want to echo that that part of, I think, the challenge of looking at these structural issues is the historical piece is huge. The accountability currently, how do we evaluate? How do we know? And some of it is, how do we find each other in the midst of this? That these are big things we're trying to take on and trying to change, and we can't do it without each other. And what does that mean in terms of giving up some, like for me, giving up whatever privilege or using my privilege to, to show up in a better way, requires lots of good thinking and lots of ways of being more real and authentic with each other that we haven't always been.
Well, thank you all so much for your insight and for the questions from the audience. We are just coming up on time, and so I have a few questions that I'll send to the panelists, and we'll get those answered and send them out to all of you so that we make sure to have them answered for you. I want to be sure that you all know where to turn if you or a family member or a loved one needs help or support in any way, 211 maintains a 24-hour central access point of information and referral for people who need assistance with family, health, and social services. Thank you all in advance for your continued support. Continue to follow United Way social media platforms to stay up to date on our latest investments, events, and volunteer opportunities. I want to thank the panelists for today. You all did such a wonderful job, and I appreciate you sharing this space with us and coming back for a few of you who have addressed this audience previously. I wish you and your families health and safety, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks for all of you. Appreciate each of you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Martha, Jamal, David.
Thanks, Purdy.
Man.
Thank
All right, family, y'all take it easy.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Sam, for making it happen.
For sure. Thank you.